order. Hearing is now resumed.
Good morning, Mr. Commissioner. The fact that I'm occupying a centrist position today should not be construed as my abandonment of my usual position on the far left. It actually has more to do with my hearing disability and the ability to see the witness than anything, Mr. Commissioner.
You're welcome wherever you stand.
Mr. English, we have been discussing your report, which has been entered into evidence as Exhibit 718 in these proceedings. And I was reviewing some of the recommendations in your report because I found them to be informative and some of them to be very worthwhile. The one that we had specifically focused upon yesterday was your recommendation number 6. And I want to take you, before I take you there, to revisit that slightly, is to refer you to your text, because I think in the body of the text, I think you flesh out that recommendation very nicely. And if I could ask Mr. Lund to pull up 102, page 102 of Exhibit 718. Right at the very top of the page, you say these words: the lack of clearly defined escapement targets for each indicator stock and the large year-to-year variability in escapement targets for each run timing group makes it difficult to regulate fisheries and evaluate management performance. And you go on to say the trend towards increasing complexity in the definition of escapement goals may have become an impediment to achieving these goals. To that I say amen. And you go on to say at the end of the paragraph, a clearly defined set of escapement targets for each indicator stock and run timing group would be much easier to communicate to fishers. Just going to stop there because I would ask you to insert the words NGOs and First Nation community as well as fishers. Would you be okay with me inserting those words in that sentence?
Certainly, yes.
Then the current complex total allowable mortality rules and still allow managers the latitude to implement harvest rate ceilings to protect less productive stocks when returns of the target stocks are large. And I think you're onto something really critical here, Mr. English, and that's why I'm spending so much time here. You may recall the discussion that we had yesterday with Mr. Commissioner as well as me and yourself about setting definable goals, setting some numbers that we're all, so everybody knows with certainty what those numbers are. You recall that discussion?
Yes.
And I agree with you that position of setting definable numbers and definable escapement targets is critical both to conservationists, to First Nations, and to the fishers, so that everyone knows what the goalpost or where the goalpost is located, as you eloquently put it yesterday. And you still stand behind that evidence, do you not?
Well, certainly, yes.
All right, so I want to then focus upon TAM, because TAM, to me, is totally confusing, and to my clients, some of whom are excellent scientists, it's confusing as well. And I would suggest that if we're going to resort to TAM, we either have a problem in communicating it, or we should find a more discernible model or a better model to use. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it has a role, but it is complicated for a lot of people to understand.
Right. And so because of the complication, it's not just a matter of complication, but as I understand the TAM rules, they're based on aggregates. It's not based on individual conservation units. Do I have that correct?
That's correct. I set TAM rules for each of the run timing aggregates.
Right. And so if you're really focused upon the conservation unit, as the wild salmon policy tells us we should be, then the TAM rules really aren't going to be able to help us, are they?
Well, they don't deal with the goals for the specific population units, if that's what you mean. Yeah.
Right. And so as a consequence, what's going to eventually happen if we keep on using these TAM rules is that fish are going to be caught inadvertently, or for example, if we take the example of the Cultus Lake sockeye, we're going to still harvest Cultus Lake sockeye by using the presently construed TAM rules, are we not?
Yeah, well, the harvest of the fish is dependent on the timing of the runs and what they overlap with. So, because unless you move fisheries into areas where certain stocks are not accessible or not vulnerable, then you're going to harvest those along with the less abundant stocks right along with the more abundant stocks.
Right, and that's the problem that we see, for example, with the late run and the cultist getting caught up with the late run. So the cultist gets caught up with some of the abundant runs, such as the Adams River and the Shuswap Lake Complex runs. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And so as a consequence, we end up inadvertently or not meaning to over-harvesting the Cultus Lake stock or the Cultus Lake Conservation Unit. Isn't that right?
Yeah, in some years there's been very high harvest rates on late run. Not so much in recent years because of the efforts to actually protect cultists. They've harvested a lot less late run than they would have if they hadn't had the cultist concerns.
Right. Now, yesterday when I went through with Dr. Sean Cox's critique of your commentary and your recommendation, you may recall that one of his critiques had to deal with, that's all very well to say that we're going to set escapement goals, but how do you do it? And I think you give us some clues in the final paragraph in that on page 102, because you then go into, and if we can look at this together, you go into the wild salmon policy. And you say the wild salmon policy has identified the need to define lower benchmarks, LBs, and upper benchmarks, UBs, for each Fraser sockeye stock. And then you refer to Kerry Holt's paper and Sue Grant's paper, and both of them have given evidence to this commission. And you go on to say, and this is where you have an innovative recommendation. You said there should be at least 2 different LBs and 2 UBs for each cyclic stock. And we talked a bit about that yesterday. And what I'm driving at is that if you, instead of using the terminology stock, because the stock, I say, is old school, is old terminology, would you agree with me that what we really should be focusing upon with respect to the wild salmon policy is the conservation unit?
Yes, that's what the intent is under the wild salmon policy, is to manage things by conservation unit.
Further on in that paragraph, you give an expression of how fishing can be conducted once you know what those lower benchmarks are. And you say, for example, if the run size is below the LB for a stock, no fishery should be permitted to target that stock. And so that is why it's so critical then to define the lower benchmark, so that we can define a point at which there would be no fishing to occur on that specific conservation unit. Do I have that right?
Yes, and there is the challenge of combining the lower benchmarks and also the goals for specific stocks into groups where you can actually manage the fisheries and look at opportunities to have fisheries in certain areas and times where you can disaggregate this stock management problem.
So did you say disaggregate? So
yes.
If you can separate the stocks in some way by going to a more terminal fishery, then you can perhaps achieve that result as well.
Yeah, or the idea there is that you don't have to eliminate all mixed stock fisheries in order to have some opportunity to harvest in those areas. You just have to spread the harvest out so that you're not harvesting all your fish in one area where they have a problem with mixed stock fisheries.
And you think that can be done?
Yes, I think it can be done. It has been done in a number of locations.
But can it be done in the Fraser? I mean, we saw Bristol Bay, and it can be done easily there because of the geographic differences, because it's easier in a context of Bristol Bay. But can you do it in the Fraser?
Yes, there's places in the Fraser where you can target the more abundant stocks. There's a trade-off, obviously, of the fish are closer to spawning and less, and some runs going to be less valuable or than they will be if they're harvested in a mixed stock area. But these are trade-offs that people need to evaluate against the concerns over the different trends for the different populations.
Does that mean that what you're conceiving of in your answer to me does that mean that you're thinking of a different fishery than the one that we presently employ on the Fraser?
Yes, definitely. It's different than the current one for Fraser.
And that would still take into consideration First Nations interests, would it?
Yes, definitely, yes. Or it must as well, because they have significant interest in its resource.
All right, I want to go on to recommendation number 8. I'm pretty limited in terms of time, and so I want to at least look at some of the recommendations that you make with respect to number 8. And if we can flip back, Mr. Lund, to page 174 of the Exhibit 718. In this recommendation, you emphatically say that DFO needs to maintain its commitment to the recovery efforts for Cultus Lake sockeye and the monitoring programs needed to evaluate these efforts. Now, one of the critiques to your report was done by Mr. Al Martin. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And Alan Martin was the former Director of Fish and Wildlife for the province of BC, is he not?
I think he was that. Yes, he's retired now, I think.
And now I take it he's a consultant at this time.
Yes, I guess they hired him as a consultant to this review.
Mr. Lund, could I have page M12? It's Exhibit 718, Appendix M. Actually, M11 to begin with, and then it carries over to M12. And under the item 4, other recommendations provided supportable. Under recommendation number 8, Mr. Martin says, I agree with the recommendation as far as it goes. However, there are a variety of sockeye salmon stocks at risk in addition to Cultus Lake. An integrated program is required. There is a need to examine the range of drivers affecting the sustainability of the species for successful recovery, and a requirement that information be provided to prevent similar events occurring in other MUs if possible. I'm not sure what he means by MUs. I wonder if he means CUs, but he's not here, so he can't clarify that for us. And your response under 8 is, if we can carry over then to M12, under the recommendation 8, and you say recommendation 8 only relates to Cultus sockeye because one of our tasks was to assess the status and recovery plan for the Cultus sockeye. We agree that Cultus is not the only sockeye stock at risk within the Fraser watershed, and recovery plans for these other stocks at risk should be developed. I'm going to just stop there. So I take it that because your terms of reference for your report limited you to Cultus Lake, you did not focus upon other conservation units that might also be in a similar situation as the Cultus Lake Conservation Unit. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And so are you aware, from having read some of the reports, such as the Sue Grant paper, that there are something in the, I think there's 8 conservation units that are in the red zone, or at least insofar as the draft copy of that report is concerned?
Yes, I've seen that report.
Right, and we heard from Sue Grant, and she has gone back to the drafting board, so to speak, and she's going to come up with a redraft of that, and hopefully before the end of this commission we will be able to see a copy of that. You're aware of that CSAS process that underlies that the review of that particular paper?
Yes, and I was there for the initial review last fall.
Okay. You go on to say, and this is where I'm not sure I understand what you mean. You say, however, we do not agree that the concerns identified for these few stocks would justify concerns regarding the sustainability of the species. I don't take this to mean that you're just saying we should just write off these stocks because they're of limited value or because they're so small. You're not saying that, are you?
No, I'm saying that they don't threaten the sustainability of the species, sockeye.
Okay. So you're then taking a view of when you say the sustainability of the species, you're taking a view of the sockeye species as a totality. You're not breaking it down into conservation units. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yes. And to be fair, it'd be even within the context of the Fraser, not globally the species sockeye.
Right. And so you're leaving out of that equation the whole concept of biodiversity, are you not?
Yeah, I'm not talking about biodiversity. I'm talking about sustainability of the species.
Okay. But, and perhaps you may not be competent enough to be able to comment on it because you are an expert in fisheries management. You're not necessarily a conservationist biologist. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've got a lot of the same background, I guess, as others, but I haven't focused on conservation biology to the same degree as other people have.
Right. But in terms of biodiversity, you would agree with me that that's a worthwhile concept to protect if we're going to be talking about Fraser River conservation units. Isn't that fair?
Yes, and that's one of the reasons for defining these goals, so that we know what we're striving for with regard to each of the CUs.
Now, I want to go back to the recommendation number 8, and specifically I want to refer to Cultus Lake and Appendix K in your report. What you've done, as I understand it, in Appendix K through Table K1 and K2 is to provide to the Commission a summary of actions that have been taken by both the Department of Fisheries and Oceans as well as what you call partners in order to protect and help the conservation unit that is known as the Cultus Lake Sockeye. Is that what you've done here?
That's correct, yes.
And so dealing with K1, I mean, it strikes me that when I reviewed this, that there's a lot of people, not just DFO, that are involved in this initiative to try to protect the Cultus Lake Sockeye. Is that correct?
Yes.
A number of conservation groups, a number of local groups, I see Fraser Valley Salmon Society, I see First Nations groups. The Sewali Band is involved in some of these initiatives. It strikes me that this is something that where a lot of people, and by the way, I understand also that the commercial fishing sector also contributes by way of funding to some of these projects, does it not?
Yes, that's what I'm aware of, yes.
Right. Well, it strikes me that this is an example where people have come together to try to protect an endangered stock, and it provides an example of how people with disparate interests could actually work together to achieve some common goal. Would that be a fair statement?
Yes, I think people have come together for quite a number of reasons to try and make sure that this stock sticks around and is brought back, recovered as much as possible.
Right. And then under your second table, under that appendix, table K2, you go into the summary of actions that have been proposed but not pursued by the Cultus Sockeye Recovery Team. Do you happen to know why some of these things have not been done? Is it a question, once again, of lack of resources, lack of funding?
I think it's a combination of reasons. I think with any one of these plans, there's a priority set, and so certain things are higher priority than others, and some may be reviewed and thought to be, not likely to be successful, so they decided not to do those.
Now, in the fewer minutes remaining, I want to move off of Cultus Lake, and I just want to jump back again to the escapement targets and escapement goals, because I want to keep on focusing upon that, Mr. English, because I think it provides an interesting key to some of the issues that we're dealing with here. The whole issue of sockeye salmon and the biology of sockeye salmon, it's complex, right? I mean, the management of sockeye salmon is a fairly complex topic. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. It's not simple.
It's not simple, but it's not. It's not a situation where we can't solve it, right? We're not at that stage where we just throw our hands up in the air and say, well, it's too complex, we just got to go away and hope for the best. We're not there yet, are we?
No, it is solvable, and it requires cooperation with all the people involved, because you got to manage the people as well as the fish.
And the reason why I want to focus upon the escapement goals, because it does provide a really simple way of trying to address a complex problem, but that if we have a definable goal in sight that everyone can turn their attention to and provide some certainty to all the disparate elements in this room, then it strikes me that that's one way of moving forward on this issue of what to do about the decline in the sockeye population. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, very much so. And just like we talked about yesterday, if you, in the opposite context, if you don't have agreement on the goal, you're definitely not going to get there.
All right. Thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, we have a very tight schedule to get all the questions completed today, and the next questioner is Mr. Harvey for Area G, and he has 60 minutes as an allocation of time.
So it's Chris Harvey for the Area G trawlers and the United Fishermen Allied Workers Union. Mr. English, I'd like to start with the farming analogy that you gave at the end of the day yesterday, because it seems to me that population dynamics, fisheries biology, is no more complicated than that. Escapement is the equivalent in this field as seeding in the agricultural field. Is that?
That's the idea.
That's the idea.
Putting the seeds, in this case eggs, in the gravel.
Yes. And you said, I think, seeding at only half is obviously less than optimum. I want to suggest to you also that seeding at double the capacity that a field can produce in that area would produce a stunted and unhealthy crop, and therefore is also not optimum.
Yeah, and it's a little more complicated in the case of fish than in the case of agriculture in that regard to what the effects of
Yes.
having more than the optimal number of eggs in the gravel is,
Yes.
because of the other parts of the life history.
Yes. But the analogy I'm using is not with the spawning ground so much as the rearing lakes, because it's the nutrient capacity and the carrying capacity of the rearing lakes that very much, well, in a number of our systems, determines the optimum amount of escapement, does it not?
Yes, and the ability of the fish to produce that number of the optimum number for the lake depends on the spawning ground habitat.
Yes.
Such that if spawning ground habitat is limited, it will control the numbers of juveniles that get produced that can then migrate downstream or upstream in some cases to the lake and then rear in the lake.
Yes. I think, well, let's use the analogy of the Shuswap system and the Quesnel system, because both those systems have been described here as being lake limited as opposed to spawning ground limited. Is that consistent with your understanding?
Definitely for Quesnel, there are components of the Shuswap system, most notably the Lower Adams River, which is clearly spawning ground limited, and has in some cases shown that you get very large returns. They're confined to a very small area.
Yes. All right. Well, at any rate, there are those two limitations. If we take the lake limited areas, such as the Quesnel, there's another analogy with farming, isn't it? That if you overseed the area, you will deplete the nutrients, just as a farmer can deplete the nutrients in his field, and thus there is a carryover effect in following seasons. That analogy applies as well, does it not?
Yeah, so in the case of Quesnel, the idea of you have more juveniles in the lake rearing, that affects, because it is more complicated than what we call primary production with seeds and agriculture, in that there's a whole food chain that supports those juvenile sockeye, and there's effects on that food chain and the dynamics of those populations that, in the case of Quesnel, have shown, in a few instances, not a large number, because there's not been a lot of cases where a huge number of fish have been put on the spawning grounds and essentially overseeded the lake.
Yeah.
But in the few instances that have, it's shown that the juveniles don't grow as large, and then you end up with a potential for less returns.
Yes. And with carryover effects in the following years, because once the food web is driven down, it will take time to recover.
Yes, and there's a variety of studies, some of the best work done in Alaska related to the carryover effects. But as I've noted there and elsewhere, there's a lot of there can be substantial differences between lakes because each lake is a different ecosystem.
Yes. But with respect to escapements and lower benchmarks and upper benchmarks, there is a kind of a sweet spot which is meant to be right between the upper and the lower benchmark, isn't it? And the more precise, the better.
Yes, there's definitely that's the rationale behind the goal set for Bristol Bay, for example, is
Yes.
there's a range, and I think if they're right in the middle of that range, they're probably the happiest.
Yes. So from a biological perspective, quite apart from the economic perspective, it is important to adhere to both the lower benchmark and the upper benchmarks.
I think I want to clarify that the benchmarks defined for that are being proposed to be defined under the wild salmon policy might not be viewed as equivalent to the ones done in places like Bristol Bay.
Yes.
The Bristol Bay ones would be more like bounds placed on an upper benchmark,
Yes.
as opposed to the lower benchmark, which is envisioned as a location where you don't want to go near if you can avoid, if you can have returns greater than that. You don't want to have fisheries, certainly if you're in the vicinity of the lower benchmark.
Yes. And that's one of the differences between Bristol Bay and our system in the Fraser, isn't it? That we don't have bounds placed on the upper benchmarks here the way they do in Bristol Bay.
Well, essentially, we haven't defined the goal, which is the intent of the upper benchmark for
Yeah.
these stocks.
And the goal that you're speaking of with respect to the upper benchmark is a biologically driven goal.
Yes,
Correct.
yeah.
Yes.
That's the idea, is that you'd use information on the biological system capacity, both spawning and rearing areas, to determine what would be the appropriate goal for seeding.
Yes. Yes. And it's biologically driven because if you don't have an upper benchmark in the sense you've described, you're basically ignoring other elements of the ecosystem, namely the food web, that is critical to the health and long-term survival of sockeye, correct?
Yeah, you should be taking all those things into account in setting that goal.
Finally, with the farmer analogy, the farmer is obviously looking for long-term maximum sustainable yield from his field. And I take it your suggestion is that fishery managers should be looking for the same thing, long-term maximum sustainable yield from the sockeye fishery resource.
Well, there's quite a bit of debate about whether you need to be looking at the maximum, but you can set targets that will produce good, sustainable returns. Whether it's the maximum that you're targeting or some optimal level is the subject of a lot of debate.
Yes. Well, I've assumed that everyone in this room would be happy with the maximum sustainable yield in the sockeye resource. And so I don't really know how controversial that is. But we'll get to the point of your criticism is that the FRSSI model loses sight of the goal, whether it's maximum sustainable yield or a good long-term sustainable yield. It tends to lose sight of it. Is that?
Yes, it's defining a harvest rule that'll produce an escapement without any reference directly to what the goal is for those particular stocks.
Yes. There should be a brief of documents in front of you. And at tab 15 is the latest pestle and Cass document, which I looked to see, best I could find was at page 0024, using the ringtail numbers. Under performance evaluation, says the overarching goal of the FRSSI process is to seek a balance between the fundamental objectives of ensuring spawner abundance and production for individual stocks and accessing catch-related benefits from the timing aggregates. That's anything but clear to me. Would you agree with that?
I can certainly see how it's unclear. I do understand what it's trying to say.
Yes. But I searched in vain in this document for a clear statement that maintaining the largest sustained abundance of sockeye, or a good sustained abundance of sockeye, in terms of what the ecosystem can support, is a goal. Did you similarly find that somewhat unclear?
Well, I can't say I've gone through every one of these documents. I don't, not sure whether there is something clearer in this document that I could find.
Okay. You mentioned in answer to questions from Mr. Leadham a moment ago that the individual conservation units have to be taken into account. But there is a way, is there not, of maintaining a large overall abundance of sockeye and protecting weak stocks. And I'm going to suggest that the way to do that is to use what Carl Walters described in his evidence here as sustainable overfishing of the weaker stocks. And I think, if I've got it right, what he was explaining is that stocks such as the cultus are habitat limited, and there are habitat degradation problems there. But a small number of a small return will sustain that genetic unit. A small return in an unproductive lake will sustain the lake. It doesn't have to be a large return in an unproductive lake. Is that something you basically agree with?
Well, I understand what he's driving at there, and the concept is, and it's a similar concept that's been identified on the Skeena with analysis that Carl Walters has done and others, to look at whether the smaller stocks can sustain themselves at these lower levels for a period of time.
Yes.
And the real issue in that regard is it appears to have been the case historically. We wouldn't have a lot of these small stocks today if they couldn't do as Carl has identified.
Yes.
But the concerns, I think, that have been expressed by a number of people are that as you go forward into the future with other challenges on these populations, that may not be the case. That what we've seen in the past may not bold out into the future.
Yes. But there's no firm evidence to support that, because in the past we have seen that where either a spawning ground or a lake rearing habitat has a small number as opposed to an overlarge number of fish in it, it will respond well. In other words, the productivity of the fish will be good.
Yeah, that's the principle behind the stock recruitment analyses, and
Yes.
and most of the evidence regarding salmon is that at lower abundance levels they tend to be more productive,
Yes.
as long as there's not a predation effect. So
Yes.
this predator pit type effect that you can get, where at very small populations, the predation is great and can hold the population down at that level.
Yes, yes, thank you. Well, getting back to the central point in your paper, that without an absence of clearly identified goals, that has led, I think, to a confusion as to how to deal with escapement. That's the basic point that you make in your paper, is that correct?
Yes.
Now, it is agreed, I think, and if we look at this paper at page 0017, it is agreed that there's by everybody, it seems, that there is a productive capacity limit for every stock. There's a paragraph beginning, the productive capacity, down, yes. The productive capacity of Fraser River sockeye stocks is limited in the freshwater environment, either by the availability of spawning habitat or by available lake rearing habitat. Several approaches have been used to estimate productive capacity for individual sockeye stocks, including available spawning area, lake productivity, numerical estimates of the capacity parameter from population models. This information can be used to shape prior assumptions about density-dependent parameters, spawning recruit model. So that's basically generally agreed what's set out there. Is that correct?
Yes, and very consistent with what I've just been saying.
Yes, but what is discussed here, the authors seem to leave out, is the empirical method, or what I think is also called the stock recruit method, stock recruit analysis method, of determining the carrying capacity of spawning grounds or rearing areas. That is another familiar method, is it not?
I think the stock recruitment models are used to look at returns, essentially returns per spawner, where you're getting the best returns per spawner.
Yes.
And they're naturally integrating a lot more than just the freshwater habitat.
Yes.
So they're looking at the returns being the fish that come back after rearing in the ocean and completing their life history.
Yes. If we look at page 102 of this paper, we see an analysis here, and I think this is the sort of thing that one looks at for a stock recruit analysis. Is that right? We have the years down the left, the run size, the spawners, the effective female spawners, and then the recruits, which would be the recruits 4 years later, generally, including some 5-year-olds.
Yeah, so this is done by brood year. This would be exactly what I'm talking about, yes?
Yes. And if we look in the upper right-hand column, there's some shading bars. For example, the 1954 year, the bars on the right, that those indications are the productivity, are they not? So that indicates a high productivity in 1954.
Yeah, it looks like it's the a portion of the maximum for each variable. So it's indicating how much greater that variable, that value is, or what portion of the maximum, I guess, of
Yes.
that variable
Yes.
is occurring in that year.
And the way these analyses work, you can look down, let's say down the effective females column, and then look at the recruits beside it and determine what is the right level, or what seems to be the right level of effective female spawners. For example, 1954, just over 1 million effective female spawners led to a high productivity, whereas 4 years later in 58, with 500,000, that's more than 500,000, about 600, 500,000 more effective female spawners, you have far less productivity. And then you go through the cycles in that manner, and it gives you an idea of what is the right level of escapement. Is that?
Well, what this is showing you the range in returns or recruits
Yes.
that you can see from a given level of spawning.
Yes. There are, of course, other factors
Yes.
in play, but this gives you a pretty good idea. For example, if we take the 1 million effective female spawners, we have that again in 1978. With a lot of bars beside the right-hand columns, good productivity.
Yes, but you also see in 1982, for example, a escapement very similar to what was in 1958,
Yes.
and it produced a substantial larger return than what was seen in the returns from the 58 escapement.
Yes. But then in 1986, there's a smaller escapement again, closer to the 1954, and it's got a better productivity. It's produced even more returns than the larger escapement in 82. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And just following through, it's interesting that the 2006 effective female spawners, 1,170,000, it's again, seems to be right on the sweet spot. We haven't got the 2010 returns here, but we know that they were the record along with the 54 or 58 return. So this, looking at this gives a biologist an idea that on the stock recruitment or empirical method, just over 1 million effective female spawners seems to be about right, correct?
It's certainly in that range, and I think if you look at the capacity for the lake rearing capacity for Shuswap Lake, the estimates that I've seen are in the order of something similar, but it can go as high as 1.9 million. The spawning escapement to produce the juveniles that will achieve that capacity.
1.9 million spawners in total?
Yes.
So about half that would be effective female spawners.
Yeah.
Yes. And I got a paper in here at tab 2. I don't think we need to turn to it, but that's based on an analysis of the rearing capacity of the lakes using cone-shaped nets to trap the fry and the little Daphne flies and other species that are used as feed. Is that correct, as you understand it?
Yes.
And through a completely different type of analysis, about the same number, around about 1 million effective female spawners, slightly less, I think, in Hume's analysis. Slightly less is optimum.
Yeah. They want to be aware that the egg to fry survival is obviously an important issue. So if that's low for whatever reason, lower, then you need more effective
Yes.
females to seed the right number in the lake.
Yes. All right. Now, is it your understanding that the old International Pacific Salmon Fisheries Commission used basically the stock recruitment analysis method? They didn't have the advantage of Hume's habitat measurements, but they used basically an empirical method to determine what they thought was optimum spawning levels. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think that was more the case back a few years ago.
And the Alaskans used basically an empirical method supplemented by some pretty good scientific experiments. Is that as you understand it?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yes. Well, let's turn to that in your report at page 4, Exhibit 718. Page 4, the Bristol Bay fishery is described. You say in the second sentence that one aspect of Bristol Bay fisheries that should be considered seriously for application to the Fraser is the clarity and priority associated with their escapement goals. A clearly defined set of escapement goals for Fraser sockeye would not guarantee success, but is one way that the management of stocks could be made simpler and increase the potential for achieving these escapement goals. Now, the report at page 126 discusses this in more detail. And I think in the interest of time, I won't deal with that in detail, but under management towards the bottom, you describe how you have local area managers, management biologists, AMBs, the AD, F, and G, that's Alaska Department of Fish and Game, I think.
That's correct.
Research biologists develop biological escapement goals for individual river systems based on sustained yield and/or maximum sustained yield, MSY principles, using relationships between escapement levels and subsequent returns, termed stock recruit analyses. So that's the sort of analyses that we looked at a moment ago.
That's correct, yes.
That's correct. The primary duty of all AMBs is to hit these goals and distribute the escapements across the season based on historic run timing schedules, etc. And you say they've been very adept at hitting the goals. The AMBs, as I understand, if I got it right, there are 4 senior biologists who basically run this system.
Effectively, yes.
They have a staff, but it sounds like the cost of running that system, which is far larger in terms of run size than the Fraser, the cost must be minuscule compared with what the DFO spends doing an equivalent exercise. Do you know anything about that?
I've heard it referred to that the costs there are substantially less. The exact amount, I'm not familiar, I can't tell you today.
Okay. And then at page 128. So I guess we could summarize that is a science-driven system, whereas ours seems to lean more towards being a consensus-driven system. Would that be a fair statement?
There's a lot of focus on consensus, certainly on the Fraser.
Yes. Page 128, paragraph beginning, although the Bristol Bay fishery is seen as a biological success story from an economic standpoint, and then you go on. Halfway down that paragraph, Hilborn, 2006, argued that the biological success story of Bristol Bay is due to clear biological objectives and clear lines of authority. So that's something you agree with, I think. Is that correct?
Yes.
At page 137, 137, there's an interesting graph here that if we could look at it. The gray area at the bottom is the escapement numbers, and the area at the top is the catch or harvest numbers. And it looks like the escapements fluctuated wildly until about 1980 or 82, the last of the big escapements, and then they comparatively leveled off. Is it a fair comment that the big escapements stopped in Alaska about the same time as they started in the Fraser?
I don't know that is particularly the case in terms of the timing. I think it's really important to note. I did ask Michael Link, who prepared this part of the report and understands the fishery up there in detail, what the reasons for the very different shape of this graph was between the pre-1980 period and post-1980 period. And he said that it was very much related to the regime shift, where the productivity increased 2 or 3-fold after 77. So it was a well-known regime shift that resulted in higher productivity for Alaskan sockeye stocks. and the breakdown of a previous pattern of cyclic dominance for this is the Kviak stock that we started to talk about the other day, that showed a very cyclic return for a number of years and was contributing a very large portion of the production.
Yes.
And that broke down here just shortly after at the same time as this change in productivity occurred.
Yes.
And so you get more production from lower levels of escapement that you're seeing in the subsequent period.
Well, without going into the chicken and egg question of which caused which, it's a well-known, it's accepted, isn't it, in this field that high escapements will trigger wild variations that's been referred to as cyclic dominance, cyclic variations. In other words, a very high escapement in one year will lead to depressed runs succeeding, and then if the ecosystem recovers, a high escapement can be supported 4 years later, but then the food web gets driven down again, and we get, as long as we have the very high escapements, you're going to have cyclic dominance, high cyclic variations.
Yeah, it's hard to get into this subject without a lot more discussion, but there are what they refer to as broodline interactions.
Yes.
Associated with cyclic dominant stocks when the cycles are very large.
Yes. And it's the relationship between the carrying capacity of the freshwater system and the number of spawners that will trigger wild cyclic variations or extreme cyclic variations, isn't it?
Well, in the case of the Shuswap stocks we were just talking about,
Yeah.
you could still hit the carrying capacity on the dominant cycle close or even be under the carrying capacity on that cycle and still have the cycle continue.
Yes.
as cyclic, and the carrying capacity is not changing appreciably between the different years.
But presumably, if you lowered escapement dramatically so that the food web remained consistent, you could iron out these cyclic patterns over time.
Well, there's been a lot of debate about whether you can remove the cyclic pattern.
Yes.
and produce a higher yield
Yeah.
of a population
Yeah.
without using the cycles.
Yeah, and it's very much a lake-specific concept, isn't it? Because lakes differ.
Yes.
But it has been observed. Well, if I'm right, that there is this correlation, necessary correlation. The cyclic variations could be triggered either by high escapement or by the carrying capacity of the lakes being lowered through habitat degradation. It would have the same effect, either lowering the carrying capacity through habitat degradation, and I'm thinking of the cultus, it would have the same effect as increasing escapement if the carrying capacity had remained the same.
Yeah, I think you want to keep habitat degradation that is not occurring on a cyclic in a cyclic nature. Habitat degradation generally takes place, and then the overall capacity is reduced because of that.
Yes.
Milfoil or
Yes.
loss of lakeshore spawning habitat or other things that have been noted for cultus.
Yes.
That's separate from the estimate of the capacity of the system and how close to that capacity you're seeding it in a given year.
But doesn't that all go to determining what the capacity is? For example, if there's a lot of milfoil and if you're approaching a eutrophic state, doesn't that reduce the capacity?
Certainly, it affects the capacity, but I'm saying is it doesn't tend to occur on a cycle, like
yes.
you have it in one year but not in another.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, no, I wasn't meaning to suggest that. All right, I think I have to move ahead in the interest of time. If we could just go to the next page, 138 in this, I wanted to note something here towards the bottom of that first long paragraph. The sentence beginning, however, the regulations, this is in Alaska, the regulations specify that the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's highest priority is to obtain escapement goals and maintain genetic diversity of the escapement. When conservation concerns arise, management plans often set out how ADF and G should strive to address such concerns amid allocation issues. It seems that they've got the same priority for maintaining genetic diversity that we have here in the Fraser.
They're referring to the same terms.
Yes. It's not as though they're ignoring conservation concerns in Bristol Bay.
No, they want to have a good seeding of the available habitat and production from all the lakes that are within a district, not just one or two of them.
Yeah, but they're not managing the system. They're producing a very successful fishery there in the way they do it with their upper and lower boundaries. They're doing that whilst not in any way ignoring conservation concerns or genetic diversity. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're not. I'd say, to be fair to the two systems, there's less focus on the small stocks in Alaska
Yes.
than on the productive stocks.
Yes. But those small stocks continue to tick over year by year, thus preserving the genetic makeup of them, don't they?
I can't say I know exactly what's going on with the smaller populations and the amount of interaction or interplay, how distinct the small populations are in Bristol Bay.
Okay. And that's just your lack of familiarity?
Yeah, and it's also fair to say that their assessment programs are not focused on determining that
Yes.
to the same degree that they are on the Fraser.
Okay. Do you know anything about MSC certification with respect to the Bristol Bay fishery?
I know that it was part of the certification process. I don't know all the details
Yeah.
regarding their evaluation.
All right. So they're going through the same process that we are here with respect to MSC certification?
Yes, they've gone through it initially before British Columbia did, before the 4 sockeye fisheries, and then they've gone through a reassessment a number of years ago. So they're using right now, their initial assessment didn't use the same criteria that was used for the BC sockeye fisheries, but their current assessment does use the same criteria.
Yes. Their fishery management strategies on, if we could look at tab 1 of the binder you have.
Which is that one? Oh, Kyle and Keeney, okay. I've got the one here.
This is the Koenigs and Kyle 1997 paper on consequences to juvenile sockeye salmon and the zooplankton community resulting from intense predation. The paper discusses the effects of overescapement at page 120 of the paper. I'll start, we could move to the next page. It's, yes, bottom of that page, that's it. Right-hand column, the paragraph reads, in fact, successive escapements 2 to 3 times above the rearing capacity of Fraser Lake. That's one of their the lakes they focused on here, Fraser with a Z, caused the collapse of a dominant year run, and subsequent brood year return per spawner ratios fell below replacement levels. Such top-down effects, if related to overgrazing the forage base, are reversible by nutrient treatment. Mentions a number of papers. Top-down control by rearing sockeye reduces the size of prey items, lowers zooplankton fecundity and density, displaces vulnerable prey species, and thereby restructures the zooplankton into a predator-resistant community. Once established, such an assemblage may resist immediate reversal to bottom-up, that's producer control, either through decreased predation or increased primary production. So that, I think, encapsulates the detrimental effects that they found from successive overescapements. Is that correct?
That's what's written in the paper, for sure.
Yeah.
Yep. Looks like it happened.
Yeah, and the paper, the Fraser Lake that they discuss is mentioned on the next, or on this page, the right-hand column, beginning Fraser Lake, 57.5 north. Second largest lake on Kodiak Island, gives the surface area. The lake has an outlet barrier that until 1962 precluded salmon access. In 1962, a single steep pass fishway was installed, another added in 79, enabled a major run of sockeye to become established. This lake has not been stocked in recent years, but nutrient treatment was conducted, so that was a good area for testing there that's discussed here. And it goes on. They discussed also two landlocked lakes in the paper, landlocked lakes that were then stocked, and then they watched very carefully what happened in the ecosystem once sockeye fry were introduced. And I'd like to turn to page 129 of the paper, which shows in the form of a graph what happens. Figure 5, seasonal mean macro zooplankton biomass and density by taxa in Pass Lake, that's the A, the top one, before stocking of sockeye salmon fry, which is the control, during stocking, and during either nutrient treatment or no stocking. So if we go back up to the top to look at these, the control, that's before stocking of sockeye, and all those black and white and the other shading areas are described as the food web, Cyclops, Daphnia, Diaptomus, Bosmia, and Holopedium. Those must be very interesting little critters, but very critical to the life of sockeye, it appears. So without this sockeye fry, there's a big mass of them. And then after stocking at 1988, they're being depleted, and by 1989, it's all black, which means that Cyclops is the only one of the 5 that remains. The other 2 wiped out, if this is correct. And then nutrient treatment and a very slow return. So this is part of what's discussed in this paper, and it encapsulates what happens when a whole lot of sockeye fry are introduced in a lake rearing system. Is that?
I think you want to be very careful that it's what happens when they did this experiment in this particular lake.
Yes. Yes.
Each lake can have a different zooplankton community. These are all zooplankton species.
Yes. If we go back to page 160 or 127, the page before this, Mr. Lund, something that I'm sorry, 2 pages before this. Yes, in the right-hand column, near the top, the last line of that top paragraph beginning, however, However, Diap Thomas never returned to 1978 levels of abundance, even after 6 years of nutrient treatment. I found that somewhat alarming because it indicates that once you do drive down these little creatures that the lake system, ecosystem produces, it can take a very long time for them to recover, depending, of course, on a number of things, but it can take a very long time for them to recover, correct?
Yeah, it appears to be the case here, and I'd certainly recommend, because I'm not an expert in limnology to anywhere near the extent that
No.
someone like Jeremy Hume
Yes.
could probably provide you a lot more useful information on Fraser lakes,
Yes.
Fraser watershed lakes,
Yes.
for comparison to this type of paper.
Yes. Why I found this alarming, it reminded me of the northern cod situation on the East Coast. Once you get a stock knocked down, whether it's a minuscule stock like these or a large fish, it can take a long, long time to recover. So that's the Alaska system. What the Alaskan the science part of glimpse of the science that the Alaska system is based on. The problem with the FRSSI model, isn't it, is that it's open-ended at the upper benchmark or upper boundary level. It doesn't have an upper boundary in the sense that once you, well, let's put it this, let's just deal with it this way. If 1 million effective female spawners is the optimum in the Shuswap, let's say 1.5 million is set as the upper benchmark under the FRSSI model. 1.5 million. If we had a huge return like we had in 2010, where you might have 10 million effective female spawners, after the managers in their models have determined that you've exceeded 1.5 effective female spawners, then 60%, the harvest continues, the exploitation continues at 60%, which means that 40% of all the excess ends up on the spawning grounds. Am I interpreting it correctly?
So you're saying that the total run size might have had potential for 10 million effective females?
Yes.
With a 20 million run size?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if 1.5 million effective females was the upper benchmark in the FRSSI model, everything between 1.5 and 10 million, 40%, well, I guess I have to go back to the 20 million run size. Let's say, which on run size, 3 million would be the upper benchmark. So between 3 million and 20 million, under this model, harvesting takes place at 60%, which means 40% goes in the spawning grounds.
Yes.
Yes, all right. So effectively, you've got a situation under the FRSSI model where you could very seriously overseed the spawning grounds. Is that correct?
If all those fish that entered the river survived their upriver migration, they would, in the example you presented, you could have 8 million fish arrive at the spawning area.
Yes. Do you happen to know how many arrived there in 2010?
I actually have those numbers somewhere, but I can't remember what it is off the top of my head.
Okay. Could we have that?
Probably in the 6 million range, I think.
Yes, yes. In other words, substantially over the, well, I'll let the numbers speak for themselves. Could this document be marked, please, as an exhibit. There's another Alaska paper, which is Exhibit 419. In fact, that's already been exhibited. I don't think I have time to go into it. I believe you've done some work on the Columbia River, Mr. English, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
If we could bring up tab 3, the paper entitled Habitat-Based Evaluation of Okanagan Sockeye Salmon Escapement Objectives. I note that in the reference page, it references one of your papers, which is why I asked that question. What I find interesting in this document is that before escapement was increased in the Columbia area, an evaluation was done of the carrying capacity. I find that curious because it seems that the same thing wasn't done in the Fraser before the large escapement increases we had in the late 90s. But in this paper, at page 24, I'll start. The Columbia, of course, one arm of the Columbia goes off to the Snake River area and the other up to the Okanagan. That's correct, isn't it? So Osoyoos Lake and Okanagan Lake are part of the Columbia River system.
That's correct, yes.
The recommendations in this paper, page 24, under number 1, we recommend provisional escapement objectives for Okanagan sockeye be set at 58,730 adults in Wells Dam units, or 29,365 adults at peak visual counts. Do you know why it is that in the Columbia we have a focus on the carrying capacity of the rearing areas that seems to be absent in the Fraser?
Well, I don't think it's fair to say it's absent.
Yes, I agree with you. I'm putting it too strong, but we have more of a focus in the Columbia area.
Yeah, and there have been extensive studies on the lakes that Jeremy Hume can probably relate to or describe to you that will let you know what they've found, and that information's not been ignored, but it's using that information to clearly define what these escapement goals are is part of the challenge.
Yes, but here in the Columbia we've got a precise number recommended, and I've not seen anything like that for the Shuswap, the Quesnel, the Chilko, or any of the other lake systems. Perhaps I've just missed it, but why have we got such a precise number in the Columbia and not so far as I've been able to tell, in any of the Fraser system lakes?
Well, it is curious why there hasn't been agreement for using the available data to identify a precise number, but that is exactly what I've been talking about with regard to setting escapement goals.
Yes, thank you. All right. Do you think it may be that the Columbia has a large U.S. involvement and influence in the way they manage the fishery, and that's resulted in this analysis being done there, or is that?
Well, there's certainly a lot of pressure coming from groups on the Columbia, like the ones that companies, the Douglas County Public Utility District that runs the Wells Dam, for example, wants to know what is the target. So there's pressure from the hydroelectric power industry on the Columbia. There's the cross-border nature of that stock. And there's a lot of things that affect how those dams are operated that are related to sockeye and Chinook and
Yes.
steelhead returns.
All right. But at any rate, the Columbia experience is that in 2008 and 2009, they had record returns in their sockeye fishery, whereas in the Fraser, we've had somewhat dismal returns. Is that?
Yeah, they seem to be on a different pattern of returns, definitely than the Fraser. And it's really important to note that the Columbia River sockeye stocks, specifically the Osoyoos Lake ones, are ones that have a adaptation to handle higher water temperatures than any of the other sockeye stocks. They're the most southern abundant sockeye population, and they have to swim through rivers that are even warmer than the Fraser during the migration period.
Mr. Harvey, how much longer do you think?
Yeah, I think it'll be 4 or 5 minutes longer.
Why don't we take the break?
Yes.
Hearing will recess for 10 minutes. 15 minutes.